Well, hi everyone. Welcome to ArtsFest Online and to the first in our series of Disability History Month talks. Tonight we'll be joined by British academic, artist, filmmaker, podcaster and disability rights activist, Dr. Paul Darke. Your host for the session is our very own Professor Megan Norton, Professor of Learning and Teaching in Academic Practice and co-chair of the Disabled Staff Network at the University of Wolverhampton. If you have any questions, please use the Q&A box and we'll go through them at the end of the talk. Just a quick reminder, a bit of housekeeping before we make a start. Please don't share any private information as this is a public platform, and of course the session is being recorded. So with all that said, welcome both, and over to you, Megan.
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me to introduce Paul. Wow, I met with Paul yesterday and he's put a visual worm in my head, which I won't spoil your pleasure, but what an incredible person. Dr. Paul Darke, he got his PhD from Warwick University looking at disability in cinema. He's been a consultant with the British Film Council, the Disability Arts Forum, and lectures at lots of different universities. Originally from Surrey, the twang is still there, but has lived in the West Midlands for many, many years. Part of the Disability History Month, which is so important to raise the profile of disability issues. Paul is a disability activist and as I said, visual artist. And I think his presentation today is going to be very fascinating in so many different ways. His title is Why Bother? The Art of Disability. Thank you very much, Paul. Over to you.
Thank you. It's nice to be here. I'll share my screen and then we can let's get on with it. Share, play from first one. So I hope you can all see that. Yes? Someone say yes?
Yeah, it looks great.
Well, thank you for coming this evening. I'm looking forward to chatting with you all. So I'd like to thank Professor Lawton for asking me, as well as Mark Austin, the course leader in graphic design, and Claire Buckerfield for asking me to do this and sorting it out and arranging it. It's a pleasure. As a graduate of the University of Wolverhampton, although I'm not a graduate of the University of Wolverhampton, I'm a graduate of Wolverhampton Polytechnic because I'm old. So there you go. My name is Paul Darke. I've been working in disability art and disability studies for about 30 years. I was born disabled. I'm a wheelchair user. My pronouns are he, him. I'll describe myself. I'm fat, old, white, 60 years old. So life goes on, as they say. Grey beard, slightly balding, receding hairline, glasses. And so that's how I look, both in the picture on the screen as well as in real life, although usually in real life a lot scruffier. I'll start by saying often I work in collaboration with other artists, not always. I work for DASH. I've done stuff with DASH, which is Disability Arts in Shropshire, now a national organisation. WMDAF, the West Midlands Disability Arts Forum. I think the key people I've worked with a long time in the past was Alan McLean, the late Debbie Jolly, Alison Wilde, legends of the disability movement. I worked for a long time with another artist called Anne Whitehurst, and I'm currently doing quite a lot of work with Dr. Miro Griffiths and Professor Simon McEwen. Hopefully I won't talk too long, and then, I'll ask questions as we're going through and hopefully take it from there. Why isn't it going forward? Because I've got to click it. So in this presentation, I'm going to talk about how we think we're hidden. Often disabled people say, oh, we're invisible. But my point in a lot of my research and activity is that we're not invisible. We're actually everywhere. And we're constantly on show all the time. And so we'll talk about why that is for a bit later on. And one of the things I'm going to talk about particularly is disability on postage stamps, because we've got a new publication coming out with some critical essays, which again I'll talk about later. But again, it's an area where people have in a way, no idea that disabled people are on stamps, postage stamps that you buy at the post office, British stamps, global stamps. And I don't just mean a few stamps. I've got thousands of stamps of global issues that from well over 100 years old, right up till, new ones coming out every week somewhere in the world. And I'll show some of them a bit later, as well as talk about them. I'm a great believer that disability as an idea, as a concept, as a kind of political movement is the last avant-garde and presents the probably a real threat to the idea of normality, given that normality doesn't exist and that it's defined by disability and impairment and those kind of things. And we're going to be looking at in reference to disability art, my art in particular, that I've done with others and I've done on my own. My expertise is in film and popular culture. And as we go through, I talk about the history of disability on stamps, as well as thinking about what stamps say. And then, at the end, kind of arguing why or why not should we bother creating as disabled people, articulating ideas, defining our identity. I've got to press the button. So one of the things I think as a disabled artist we need to do, as academics, as people, it's not just as art, it's the whole thing, is to disrupt. And one of the great things I did this piece and lots of other similar pieces like this is getting popular art, well-known art, and placing disabled people in it that fit into it, or even just in collage or contrast or contact, just to put us in it and to disrupt that kind of flow about what art is, what the canons are. And I think this is a piece of, virtually everybody knows this. It is probably my most favorite work of art, which is Nighthawks. And working with, and we put, that's actually me when I was about 15 with my best friend. And you can see in the back on the left, that's me and my friend, we were about 15, tailored to the artwork, exploring us in a major work of art. And I think it's a good thing to do. And we often spoke about doing a kind of copycat art as a way of constantly showing how we are not in that art, even when we often should be. So most contemporary art, we're only in it as freaks, contemporary art, historical art, and as objects of curios and atmosphere, not as individuals. And so this was just us putting us in pieces of work. We did it with a Renoir, a Manet, a whole load of Edward Hoppers. There's a whole series we did of Edward Hoppers. I have a very large print of this as well, framed, that we use for an exhibition. So then the other thing I was talking about in the title of the little write-up about what I was going to talk about was the notion of disabled people and fear. And we both instill in fear in others because of ignorance, because of a lack of awareness, but equally they instill fear in us through the reaction, through the response to what we have created. And again, it's not anything intrinsic about us. It's about the nature of society to impose that onto others, onto us. And so this was a piece of work, again, with Anne Whitehurst and Alan McLean, that we did. We did this many years ago. It was proposed for Sherwood Forest on a Sustrans track. And the idea was it was a Holocaust memorial, because at that point, there weren't any Holocaust memorials for disabled people, given that the Holocaust or the Nazi exterminations started with disabled people. They practiced on disabled people. And this was a kind of sculpture. We came up and did a digital visualization of it. I've spelt it wrong as well. See, my spelling is terrible. I'm a working class lad. I had no formal education. I went to special schools. I left college, left school with no qualifications, which, and again, this links into the art because I had no formal education. I think I was at an advantage, particularly when I came to my PhD, apart from with my grammar and syntax, in that I was able to think, and I think this is a benefit a lot of artists, particularly who haven't had any formal education, can just think outside of the box, go off in tangents, you know, just and be much more imaginative than the kind of narrowness that often a formal education can teach you. And equally, as a disabled person, you have a whole different way of thinking. I do. I'm not claiming that for everybody else. A whole way of thinking that is outside of the ordinary, because we've never been within the ordinary. And so we think differently, we see differently, we experience it differently. And so this was never actually made, because we developed this as a kind of pilot, a kind of R&D, and this is what we came up with. But of course, the money then wasn't there to build it. I think it was going to cost about 45,000. I still think it's a lovely piece of work, and it looks really good. There's whole issues there about, you know, the wheelchair is often the symbol of disability, when in fact only about 15% of disabled people are in wheelchairs. My defense of that is that my work comes from me, and again, the people I was with, and we're in wheelchairs, so that was our experience of it. And again, this is what I think is often very important to myself, is not a single thing can represent everything. And so I often argue that we need a plethora of, particularly if you're talking about Holocaust memorials, there should be lots of them in different forms, different styles for different groups. And sort of so, and that's the problem when you just want one. And that's often the problem that disabled artists or disabled people are forced to inhabit, is that, you know, we're only given one opportunity and it has to represent everything. Whereas ordinary artists, ordinary people, that's not the case. So, and I mentioned revolution, and I think, to me, as a disabled person, just being alive is a revolutionary act nowadays, because we're in, well, particularly in the current state, where the state seems very happy for lots of us to die. You know, 60–70% of all those who died of COVID, for example, were disabled people. There's a great acceptance that if you have underlying health issues, that you don't really count if you die. So just the very act of survival and continuing is an act of revolution. And again, putting yourselves in the painting, putting yourself in the piece, in the society, in the object, in the history. And we come back about a bit later. So these are a couple of other things I did, and that picture on the right is a very famous picture of World War I veterans. And so digitally manipulated, I have a large print of this. And of course, every single one of those people is me, transposed onto the head at different points in my life. And so from a very young person to an old person, and all that kind of stuff. And then on the left is a project we were trying to do fairly recently. I think the next page, it talks about it a bit more, is in Wolverhampton, as the organizer, we did the Wolves in Wolves sculpture trial, which wasn't about disability, but it had a very core disability element. The vast majority of the people who did it were women, which was very important to us, where the artists were women. And a significant, if not most, of the people involved had an impairment of one kind or another to do with the kind of whole process, the design, the everything. So one of the things we wanted to do was very specifically in Leicester about Joseph Merrick, i.e. the Elephant Man. And because Joseph Merrick is from Leicester. And we'd done it very successfully in Wolverhampton. And so we went to Leicester. And of course, to do anything like this, you must have local authority kind of backups. They must be a key stakeholder in it. And everybody we met up until a certain point thought this was an excellent idea. It was empowering. It was about, you know, enabling disabled people to paint a design about impairment, disability, that represented them on an icon of kind of disability culture. But the higher it up it went, it suddenly started getting no's. No, we can't do this, because they were terrified. The local authority was terrified of two things in particular: that it would upset people, and the idea that there were too many cripples in Leicester already, because of course Leicester is the home of Richard III, and so they were very keen to maintain Richard III, because that was kind of like a kind of impairment disability that they could control. They had the narrative and whatever, and the idea of disabled people having their say on how they were represented was just far too scary for them. The irony to me was that they said it might be very controversial, and they found that a problem. And again, to me as an artist, and even just someone who's done marketing plans, the more controversial you can make it, the better, because that's what brings audiences, that's what brings people. And most of these trials, again, it wasn't a particularly original idea. The object was the style of it, who was going to do it, but there's sculpture trials everywhere. We've done one of Wolves in Wolves. And so it was just such a cracking idea, but it just got cut dead. We've had mini ones made, and we're getting a whole load of artists to do them, putting them in glass cases like specimens. So one of the most fascinating things is we went down to see Joseph Merrick in the museum in London. It's in a little museum in Whitechapel, where they have his body or his bones. They have a replica on display and his real bones at the back. And so we wanted, they were very keen on it, because again, it was going to bring an audience to them. But it was fascinating how the fear of Leicester City Council became a major problem, that we just couldn't do it. And it was quite disappointing on so many levels, that they were frightened at what we would design on them, and that they could only deal with one at a time. So again, that fear is there, and it's why it's so important. You know, we come back to the why bother. This is why we've got to do it, to challenge all of those perceptions and ideas. So I'm doing 3 different projects at the moment in collaboration, one with the Museum of the Home, one about activism, and another one about Germany in the 1930s. So we're making documentaries as well as doing other elements. And again, I run an organization called Outside Centre, and we've been very keen to access heritage as something that disabled people need to be a full part of. And so we've developed this project with the Museum of the Home to fully ensconce disability within their collection and within their exhibition and their program. And it's a very bold move by them. And so that is really exciting to us. And even simple things like school photos, because I've been reading over the many years, and you get it on Twitter all the time, how individual children, disabled children, are excluded from mainstream school photos, or they're hidden at the back or right at the side to be almost invisible. And again, I went to a special school, and again, this links into so many kind of tangential ideas that I think are absolutely fascinating, that actually show the kind of thought processes that are often contradictory within one's own mind. So, for example, I'm against segregated education, but equally, I'm really glad I went to segregated school, because it was an empowering experience. We weren't educated, so we relied on one another. We relied on ourselves. It gave us a great deal of independence intellectually to one another. And so there's that element, but equally segregation is wrong, and I'm against it. But actually, I'm so glad I went to segregated school. And there's many contradictions that you can't necessarily get over. They are just contradictions that are both intellectually, morally, and philosophically at odds with one another, but that's just the reality of being a human being, particularly a disabled person in a ordinary, normalizing society that wants to pigeonhole, categorize, and marginalize X number of people in particular ways. Just as a matter of note, this was a particularly interesting special school because it was solely for people of a single impairment. And lots of things come out of it. So, for example, the school doesn't exist anymore, and people tend to perceive that's because of greater integration. Of course, it's got nothing to do with integration. It's because the impairment that it was for, which is what I have, which is spina bifida, we have basically been erased from existence through screening and modern technologies. And so that photograph doesn't just tell you about the history of that moment, it tells you about the history of spina bifida. Pre-1960, you died because often you had hydrocephalus, different other things. So pre-60, the technology didn't exist to keep us alive. And then by the 1970, the technology was developed to erase us through screening and all those kind of things. And so that 10-year period, which is where everybody in that picture was born, including myself, is a fascinating, it tells you about the past, that moment, and the future once it's put into a kind of heritage context. And again, this why bother, it's so important that we put ourselves into that context of the past, the present, and the future. This is just another example of us placing disabled people, disability, the symbols in public spaces. And again, this was a project we did last year, was the Family Tree, which was an exhibition at the Wolverhampton Art Gallery. It was up for about a year, from 2018 to nearly 2020, but the pandemic, bizarrely, the pandemic meant it stayed up longer rather than it should have. But again, often family histories. I think you've seen the BBC recently do one of their programs that have started to include disabled people. But again, these are bold, brave even, to actually put ourselves at the forefront of disability. So lots of pictures there are of me, but equally the family, and identifying other disabled people within the family that are forgotten or spoken about. So, for example, I know a particular family, there's lots of kids, everybody says, you know, I'm one of X, but actually they're one of X plus one. They never mention the one who died young of Down syndrome. And again, I'm not blaming people. It's about trying to get people to acknowledge a history that's hidden. And you can do that through the simplest of things. And you start to reveal a whole culture, a history, and a kind of reality that isn't acknowledged. So how do I see disability? We've got a couple of pages now where I talk about what disability is. Hold on, I've just got to have a little drink of water as I'm talking so much. There's key kind of ideas that I think about disability, mainly coming from when I did my PhD. And there's a couple of things. To me, culture, and this is why I'm so fascinated by culture, history, art, politics, culture, the whole thing. It's the battlefield to gain the cultural hegemony, or hegemony, we always said hegemony, over what is disability, because it's a contested idea, as is impairment. Equally, I was always struck by Angela Davis's, who was a great kind of black revolutionary of 60s America, that individual advancement is no indication of group progress. And in fact, I would often argue, in my view, actually individual advancement usually indicates the opposite, i.e. group digression. We're going backwards often. And I think, for example, see that in relation to, say, something like what I was born with, spina bifida. You know, certain individuals are highlighted, profiled, put up the front, but actually most disabled people still live in poverty, trapped in bad housing. They are have secondary low-level education, nothing to do with their abilities, nothing to do with themselves, but purely social constructions of marginalisation. And you see that now. So, for example, we on the surface are probably more visible than we've been in a long time, particularly in the media and whatever, but kind of politically and culturally, and the reality of disabled people's lives is often getting worse, particularly due to various austerity, government cuts, all of those kind of things. I'll just press that one. So, stamps. Now we come on to the stamps. I'll talk about the prism through which I look, but I started to get interested in about 2001. I went to a stamp fair. I got a young son, and we were thinking of things to do, you know, and everybody says young children should collect stamps. So we went to a stamp fair, and thinking, you know, I generally think that they were pretty boring, but I saw a stamp, and it was that one on the left, Swaziland, and I was stunned because I'd never seen such a stamp, and it's such a cracking image of a young girl on crutches with one withered leg, atrophied right leg, and standing up and whatever. And so at that point we were doing a project. It was also a live art performance, and I just loved stamps, and it seemed to represent so much. So you've got the establishment with the Queen, you've got they were first, second class, I've added third class. And so we constructed, and so the picture of the stamp that I created, which again we have in a single frame image, quite large, which was to go with a live art performance as well, which we did at Warwick Arts Centre, we did in Leamington Spa. When I say we, it was me and Whitehurst and Alan McLean and Tony Musto. We got a grant off of the Arts Council, for which we're always grateful. We had these 3 very large crucifixes built. When we put them up in the garden, I think the neighbours were deeply disturbed at the kind of people they were living next to, having a load of crucifixes in the garden. We got a load of wheelchairs off of a local wheelchair supplier. They were all going to be thrown away, crushed. And it was just such a perfect image for me. And the performance that existed revolved around the base of these things, and so the legacy of it was fundamentally this image out of the live performance. So that's what sparked my interest. So we then started going to lots of stamp fairs. But before we get into that, I'll talk about the prism through which I kind of look at stamps. And there's kind of 4 key areas that I theoretical ideas, 5 really, because the primary one is the social model of disability from Mike Oliver's The Politics of Disablement. And out of that's disability is a social construction. We have an impairment, which means I can't walk, but the reason I can't get into a building is because of steps that have been intentionally built as exclusionary aims. But also about Foucault's panopticism, you know, imposing behaviours on the population through kind of watching them all the time. And that's where we come in as being, we are so visible, yet everybody feels we're invisible. I really love the Frederick Jameson term, always already read, which I think was just a fantastic phrase. I think I based my entire kind of PhD on that thought, that when you come to an image of disability, you have culturally become so aware of what disability is constructed as through culture. So, and that links into Richard Dyer's kind of notion of stereotypes, broad brushstrokes. And then we come into ableism as Mira Griffiths and other similar great kind of articulators of contemporary disability have identified. Ableism being the idealization of able-bodiedness, a cherishing of attributes that feed into prejudice, etc. Initially, I'd looked at Colin Barnes's 11 Stereotypes of Disability, which are all there. And I was very taken by Marion Young's The 5 Tools of Oppression. And again, if you want to look all these up, you'll get this PDF at the end if you want it. And again, stamps cover all of these. But in the end, I came up with my version of what to me disability was, particularly in culture. And that there's only two kinds of disabled people in culture. And that's the good cripple and the bad cripple. The one that can be normalized or seeks to be normalized as a kind of role model of normalization, or the bad cripple, the one who doesn't, simply, and that's all the others. And tied into that was the idea that disabled people in culture, it's normality drama theory, that disabled people define normality rather than normality is undefinable because it doesn't exist. So disability is used, impairment, disabled people are used to define that for them. And that's why it's in constant flux and changes depending on the government, depending on kind of economics. There's a whole reason why. One of the best examples of that in culture, I think, is Tom Waits in The Fisher King, who talks about how we represent a kind of red light system. You can read that to yourself because I'm talking for too long, but you get that. And again, it's in The Fisher King, Tom Waits, 1991, directed by Terry Gilliam. And that's a great piece. That's probably the best piece of cinematic explanation I've seen. So then we come to now and the disability stamp book. I'm not going to show you any pictures from this because if you go to the website, you can download your own free copy of it and think about what we're saying, what I'm saying through this talk. So 1981 was the UN International Year of Disabled People. And that was a year of global stamp issues about disability. I think I say somewhere in the book, 1981 to me meant a free boat ride on the Serpentine in London. That's the only thing I remember about it. In the book, which was funded by Unlimited from a lockdown grant, a micro grant, and they're supported by the Arts Council of England, we collected all of the stamps. So every stamp from 1981 is in the book. Equally, we had some interesting, exciting, and absolutely brilliant critical essays from Alison Wilde, Mira Griffiths, Dr. Alison Wilde, Dr. Mira Griffiths, Nigel Smith, and Professor Simon McEwen, as well as some rambling from me. So just stepping back from that, because you can then go to that book yourselves, the stamps of disability are pretty much similar to the kind of cultural history of disability. There's the charity stamp, begging, the noble warrior, the warrior, the heroic normal, them and us. The kind of we're equal, we're promised, organizations trying to say, oh, look, we are fair, we are just. Equally, the state going, aren't we great, particularly in relation to royalty. And equally, what I found most interesting was countries defining how they're perceived externally through their stamps. So disabled people are often used to sort of demonstrate, oh, look, we're really poor, please send aid. But equally, 1981 tried to make disability a political issue. And then you get the sporty super cripple, which is the very kind of modern one, the good cripple, as I like to call it. So, but equally, they have disabled people in them, Helen Keller, Roosevelt, all of those kind of things, and they have all impairments. It's just similar, exactly the same to the rest of culture. So the charity stamp, we can see France 1938, Mozambique, Portugal 42, as well as Finland 54. You've got stamps being used to kind of promote very charitable, begging kind of mentalities, be that, let's go back, enabling the blind people to do basket weaving, buying them radios, and offering charity. Then you got the noble warrior. And I think some of these are my favorite stamps from Islamic Revolution devotees in their wheelchairs, often veterans from like the Bosnia, 1916, Italy, just they're there. But again, they still all exist both historically and in chronology, as well as all at the same time, depending on the country you are. You know, countries that are at war have these now, and similar kind of things, veterans and all that kind of stuff. The heroic normals, you know, the kind of Rotary and the Lions. And again, I'm not criticizing those organizations what they do, because if they didn't do it, it would be worse, and it's good that they do it. But what's interesting is how stamps, through the stamps about that, they perpetuate a certain view of what disabled people are, as pathetic, as weak, as in need, as well as identify heroic heroes. You see Marshall Islands 87, Pakistan 2000, Mali. So then we get the kind of we're equal, and that's both states and organizations. The Scouts showing, oh, we have disabled people in, you know, now, you know, you've got the Girl Guides, you've got different organizations. We let them dance with us, and that using images with and against and paralleling is fascinating. Ain't the state great? You know, we do so much for the disabled. Look, we're a great state. And you can see in this set of images. And again, you're going to get this PDF afterwards if you want it, and you can talk through it, but equally download the book and you'll be able to see it. So you've got the kind of cliched classic images of disability. And again, every impairment is there. We're so poor. These I found particularly fascinating, often linked to the organizations, British Red Cross, Rotary, Lions. Again, UNICEF is a very one, you know, trying to look more and more pathetic to get that funding to do programs that need doing, and often they can't afford. But actually it's about depoliticizing that and reducing disabled people to charitable objects. The Ethiopia stamps from 63, I think, are particularly wonderful. I love, the more awful it is, the better it is, in my view. Oh, I've gone too far. So, but there are attempts, both by states, organizations, as well as organizations like the UN, to make it a very political issue about the lack of employment, the kind of the use of mines, not in a kind of aren't we great kind of way, but you know, just that they're wrong. And again, this is the Gabon one, I think, was a really good one. And they've been going for a long time as well. So they're all there on France 1932 about professionals and employment of disabled people. Right, and again, you get them all now and at all time. What's fascinating is the 1981 IYDP stamps were in a way the first really global issue of disability. They'd all done them before, but not in a particularly coherent or organized way. The UN and the kind of postal organizations weren't necessarily that coherent before, but they started to become more coordinated. And the only thing that has equaled that significantly since, apart from individual anniversaries, often for people like Braille or Helen Keller, is the Paralympics. And again, this is a particularly ideological kind of trend, in my view, that comes back to the very modern idea of the good cripple and the bad cripple. These are the good cripples, those who are deserving of equality, and those who aren't. So the good cripple and the bad, and the sporty cripple, the Paralympics. So again, the Paralympics is often idealized as states cut funding, support, education, housing, all of those things are cut. But as long as, you know, we plug the Paralympics, we're really great. And again, I mentioned that there were people. This is just some examples: people, art, culture, literature. So Ireland did one of, you know, cinema with My Left Foot on it. I think Monaco did James Stewart in a wheelchair, Hitchcock Celebration from Rear Window, etc. From nursery rhymes, great art. Great art is often on stamps. And then key individuals from Ray Charles, Stephen Hawkins, everyone is there. I dread a major death anniversary because it's going to cost me a fortune. The Braille 200th a few years ago, virtually every country in the world did something about it. Britain is pretty dreadful actually on anniversaries like that, which I'm pleased for because our stamps are often quite expensive. But again, they're all there, and every impairment, every kind of aid for disabled people, everything is actually on stamps. So the book, coming back to the book, there's some information about it there. 76, the UN declared 81 International Disabled People, out of which comes the International Day of Disabled People every year, which is, this book is being launched on the 40th anniversary of that, on this year's International Day of Disability. You know, the articles in the essays in the book, I wrote about collecting, because to me, collecting, I think it was Pierre Bourdieu, the French kind of philosopher, who said that when you collect, what you're really collecting is yourself. You're trying to give yourself meaning in the randomness of existence, the kind of existential notion of seeking meaning. And by collecting, and I'm a terrible collector of disability stuff, and he's absolutely right. And so Alison Wilde's article is about colouring stamps. There's a kind of disability studies perspective from Mira Griffiths, a genius piece, obviously, as well as other pieces, personal reflection by Nigel Smith, etc. Thanks to those contributing authors, thanks to Unlimited, Outside Centre as well for funding it. We are planning to print some, but at the moment you can get a free download, which is a PDF which has alt text on the images that explains what the images are, or you can download it as an ebook, or you can look at it on Issuu as well. So why bother? Because change is possible. There are allies, and as much as we may be stepping right back into the dark ages at the moment, there is no alternative. The only alternative is to turn over and die. And that is attractive, don't get me wrong. I think about that many, many times. But I come back to the idea that simply living as a disabled person is an act of revolution. Go to the website, download the book, and if you don't read the articles, just enjoy the pictures. And I'll end by saying, or paraphrasing Aretha Franklin, if you look into your heart with a positive mind, take self-inventory of your glory, leave behind the bad things, telling everybody out loud how you become so proud when you thought there was nothing left. I do believe we will find ourselves. Thank you for being here.
Thank you very much, Paul. That was incredible. And as I say, you've set I've been thinking of stamps and images of disabilities for the last couple of days now. We have a couple of questions that have come in from people, if you'd like to have a look at them. And we could ask. So the first question I think is also about sort of an approach to intersectionality, but really, how do disabled art groups extend that kind of inclusion properly, and how do people start and get involved in different groups and different areas, particularly if people like prefer to be alone but also want to share and learn from others and get things published and exhibitions for amateurs. So that's sort of a very general one, I think, really linked to the networking, the disability aspects that you're involved in.
Well, I suppose I'd fundamentally say you've got to contact all of those disability organisations that exist, like Unlimited, particularly in relation to arts, but often local organisations. And I think most of them are open, some of them aren't, but they're open to flexibility, to change. And often if they run courses repeatedly, you don't have to do it all at once, you can do it over a long period of time. And I think there's a great deal. Organisations are becoming a lot more flexible. They're not all, so just keep looking until you find it. I think intersectionality is very important. I've been trying to think about this actually, and I think at the heart of it, I'm starting to think that identity politics isn't really the answer in the long term. But I think kind of intersectionality and identity politics is very important in the short term for the way people to become engaged, educated, and politicized. But, you know, I'm an old leftist, and to me, I always come back to the notions of class and capitalism. But actually, that is too difficult and too radical for so many people. And that I think identity politics is very important as people's route into a kind of consciousness to deliver change for everybody. And I think that's where it stands. But equally, it's just finding those organizations, getting those links, and try, in the worst case scenario, link with people who want to set up a similar organization to you to deliver what you need, how you want it. You know, that's what we did. We started in 1999, became registered charity. It was the three of us at the beginning, and there's some of us different people now along with me, to be able to do it how we want to do it. And the funding is there, lottery, it's there. So often the answer is you just got to set it up yourself. And however daunting that seems, it may be the only option. And it's what we did.
Another question has come in about what have you got any thoughts on non-disabled actors playing disabled characters in terms of representation of the good of the bad cripple?
I don't have a problem with non-disabled actors playing disabled people. The problem is if it's only non-disabled people, because disabled actors want to play lots of roles, as all actors do. And by narrowing it down to like only certain people should play certain roles, you're actually, once you do achieve a degree of success, you're closing it down for that kind of plurality. Don't get me wrong, in the short term, there's far too many non-disabled people playing disabled actors in a particularly negative way. Most characters in cinema are bad cripples, with very few that are good, and often very ideologically driven. It's too narrow to say, you know, we should be doing that and they shouldn't. We should all be doing it. We should all have those opportunities. And what we've got to create is a kind of plurality of expression from the plurality of society. I hope that answers it.
And I think it's worth perhaps, Paul, exploring for those, Disney has always used a form of disability and has been heavily criticized to show its bad characters, even to the point when animals are the main story characters. Scarface in The Lion King, his physical badness is represented throughout. That's been there's a lot been written about that, hasn't there? Same with James Bond villains as well. We were talking about that just the other day, weren't we?
Yep, absolutely. And that's why it's about so much more than actors. It's about every creative level, because often once disabled people are involved, and this is what to me is much more important than the role being played, you start to get the depth, because you then got the understanding and the intelligence behind it that is more than just a stereotype, a broad brushstroke, or even what I tend to think is they tend to be archetypes. They're seen as universal truths about what disabled people are, or what people with impairments are. And so that makes it it's much more complex. It needs much more structural change. And as to the last question, email me and I'll talk to you a bit more about it.
Thank you very much. Have we got any more questions that they can either push into the chat or into the Q&A?
Well, I see someone said, what is your view of the future of disability arts in being a useful vehicle for emancipation? I think it is the key vehicle for emancipation, because I think it's often the only thing that we get funded to do. And I think, to me, disability art is a political thing. It is a political act about expression of the experience of being disabled as a social construct. It's not art and disability, it's disability art. And so I think it is essential and vital.
Well, there's an interesting one coming. Not really sure if you've seen the recent adverts for Barbie dolls, which includes one that is a wheelchair user. Do you have any thoughts on this? Is it capture or progress, or a mixture of both?
Well, it's a mixture of both. I collect disability toys as well. So I've got wheelchair Becky, as well as loads of little models of Quasimodo and all that kind of stuff. So I'm an obsessive collector of a lot of disability stuff. I know a friend of mine, another legend, collects pop, what are they called? Pop dolls or whatever. I can't remember what they're called, but I think, but I think, again, it's not about saying, terrible representations of disability are not intrinsically bad. They're only bad if that's all you get. Because, I think a lot of disabled people would love to play the most awful disabled person. And I love the worse it is, because the joy of it, because you can see how society thinks of you which is always a great. I remember seeing something with disabled people, and it was just awful, and we all loved it because you thought, yes, we're right. That is how they see us, and it's actually quite liberating to see that. So, and again, I'm not against anything intrinsically in itself, but what we need is a kind of plurality of expressions, opportunities, and activity.
I think this follows on to the next question, really. So how can society's fears of disabled people be changed?
I think they can be changed by all of the things I said in the thing, by existing, by challenging, by putting ourselves in there, by placing ourselves in history, by placing ourselves in the present, and by placing ourselves in the future in as many ways, shapes, and forms as we possibly can. You know, as many organizations as possible, creating as many things. Dash doing a lot of stuff is excellent. And again, it doesn't, I've always been a bit wary of the idea of quality, because to me, quality is a thing that's often used to exclude people. I don't mind if a lot of things are crap, if they make you think about things, disability, disabled people. And then they start, and you know, if someone says, well, it's crap, we're saying, that's because you didn't let me go to art school. That's because I wasn't allowed to be educated. And you can build up so many levels of articulation, of oppression, of marginalization, of ableism, that it will enable you to challenge that in the long term. I think, but we need to do it on every sector. We need to do it about, you know, because my personal view is disability is under real serious threat, particularly certain impairments, you know, because I come from a group who are being wiped out, you know, so few of us are now born or allowed to live compared to in the past. We're being conceived on the same levels, that it needs to be about medical, it needs to be about the culture, about art, history, politics, economic, it needs to be about everything. And I think that that's how you challenge it, by constantly talking about it, speaking about it, creating about it, delivering about it. And I know a lot of organizations do great stuff. And even if it isn't great stuff, they're doing lots of it. And that's as important.
There's a question here. Can you suggest any films that portray disability closer to how disability politics and activism engages with disability?
Well, apart from The Fisher King, and it's one little scene in it, but I recommend everybody watches that one little scene. Not particularly. There's a lot of documentaries by disabled people that are quite good. Again, if you want to email me, my email's on the PowerPoint you can download, or the book. I think there are a few. I can't think of them off the top of my head. I think often there's a lot of, and it's a difficult one because again, coming back to the terrible representations, I think often the more terrible it is, the more rewarding it is as a cultural experience, because it teaches you what society thinks about you. Even if it's not engaging with the idea, it's revealing the kind of structural barriers that we face that you can talk about and express. I think often disability movies, impairment movies, are mainly about the good cripple, the bad cripple, or creating kind of sentimentality. There are some, you know, listen to the podcast that myself, Miro Griffiths, and Alison Wilde do, which again you can listen to on the website. I did podcasts with a guy called Theo Newman. We did about 50 of them. And then we've done about 10 or 8 of the new ones with Miro and Alison. We talk about cinema, and we talk about some films that are really good and some films that are really bad. Also, I'd recommend that you read Alison Wilde on Disability Arts Online. She's a regular reviewer there, much better than me because I'm old, and I'm not particularly ensconced in in academia at the moment. And so I'd recommend looking at, everyone should sign up to Disability Arts Online anyway, because you get a whole range of stuff that taps into how you challenge it, and equally identifying stuff that you can go and see and read and experience.
I think there's in the chat, I just want to pick it from Lizzie, just said, I just wanted to say thank you for this talk, Paul. I'm currently working on a project of expressing my experience with chronic pain through a series of playing cards. And it can often feel really pointless, like nobody will care about the work when it's made. So I think that's, there's a lot of very interesting things going on. And I think it's about taking things into different areas.
Absolutely. Do you feel the part of the problem is that there are such?
So it says, do you feel the part of the problem is that there's such low expectations of disabled people, and that we're defined by our disability and not perceived as being capable of living successfully independent lives? I think really it's very interesting because it's such a broad stroke and everybody's an individual. If you look in the School of Art and Design, there are many of us. I started in an arts background who have a hidden disability. There's an awful lot of dyslexic people in art and design because that's what you were told you could do, because you couldn't read and write. So you went into arts. And I think it is defining how you are perceived yourself, and also what is your measure of success, and how are you going to break the molds and challenge what people perceive of you. I think perhaps there are low expectations. And I think there's also, as Paul said, this notion of the savant, gosh, aren't you wonderful? Gosh, look at, you've got this disability, and wow, what have you done? And those kind of images, that kind of the achieving against all odds is another difficult representation, isn't it, Paul?
Absolutely. And I'm talking to Lizzie in particularly. I get to see the playing cards. But the answer to in 6435, I'd say, it is a problem, but actually all of the things we've talked about are the way to challenge that idea. And the more of us doing it and engaging, even if it's disruptive, it all contributes to it. And the more of us doing, the more things at every level, that's the key.
We just have 2 minutes left. If there's any other questions that you want to put into the Q&A or into the chat, we've probably just got.
I think there's an interesting thing about folic acid, which again relates to spina bifida. I don't have a problem with prevention as a kind of social process, but often with disability, it isn't prevention, it's erasure. And the thing about folic acid, again, I remember because my charity is called ASBAR, called something else now. I don't have a problem with the government because enabling people to be the best that they can be they disabled or non-disabled. My problem is that the main charity for us shouldn't be promoting that. It should just be promoting us, people with spina bifida, not going, we support that over there to get rid of us. You want to do that, that's fine over there. Our lot shouldn't be going there. We should be saying, we're brilliant, we're wonderful, we're great.
And I think that's always been a tension, hasn't it, between the charities and the people they supposedly represent. So deafblind, you're not going to get money unless you have the poor child, and it comes around every single Christmas, that can't say, like, change that person's life. And it is that tension between happy, jolly people not raising a lot of money, people who've been successful not raising a lot of money. And I think there is a real tension between charitable representations of people with disability and what those representations are trying to do, compared to those of us who are involved in it. And I think the not about us without us is an absolutely key concept, and that's where that tension is, isn't it, between the victim of a disability that needs support and help from able-bodied, or the people who are actually, this is me, deal with it.
Absolutely. Thank you for coming tonight.
So I really want to say thank you very much, Paul. You've raised lots of issues, apart from the fact that I'm never going to stop thinking about different postage stamps. And we did try and get Paul to think of extend his postage stamp collection to other areas, but he said he can't afford to. So we thought, we could go down into the Leonardo da Vinci kind of who's perceived as being dyslexic, obviously wasn't assessed at this time. I'd like to thank you all very much for coming in, and I think I really want to thank very much the Faculty of Art, Business and Social Sciences and School of Art and Design for putting on these series of events, because I think it's so important for Disability History Month that we recognise that disabilities is here. We should be celebrating disabilities, and I think this is very much where we as a university also want to promote this kind of an affirmation model, as actually saying, disabled people have lots of skills, abilities and gifts, And actually, if we look at those skills, abilities and gifts, rather than look at what can't be done, then that is something that we want to promote and we want to move towards. So thank you very much for everybody who's come. And again, thank you very much, Paul, for your contribution and your thought-provoking presentation. Thank you.
Thank you.